let's talk about the question. Reason why I came here to ask Dr. David Stovall. Dr. Stovall, if you were mayor of Chicago or alderman in some of these wards over here, how would you stop the crime in your neighborhood, in these neighborhoods?
Well, this might sound a little strange to some folks, but folks who've actually been doing this work, I think it's a little more sanguine. I would place a moratorium on all school closings. And this is what this is why this is so important to me. I think really looking at the work of the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, grassroots education movement, people like Teachers for Social Justice, Brighton Park Neighborhood Council, Blocks Together, Organization of the Northeast, Kenwood Open Community Organization, these folks who have started to collectivize around school closings, because this is what we're not talking about in Chicago. When you close a school and you send a group of young people to the school that remains open, you could be engineering a conflict. Now, a lot of people don't like to talk about that, right? Especially at the high school level. And they decided this year not to close any high schools. But this thing around closing schools and then putting these young folks in different situations where now they have to do two things. They might have to cross particular neighborhood boundaries that are in a hyper-segregated city mean something. They could mean something in terms of their safety. Other thing that's as important, they'll have to shift to the culture of a new institution, right? So if the people in that institution are not familiar with them and don't know the families there, it can be very difficult for them to adjust. And this is what we know about mobility rates. If a young person transfers either mid-year or in consecutive years, when they go to a school, they could be anywhere from 6 to 8 months behind in instruction. And those are the type of things. So for me, in terms of addressing crime, and that's more from a longitudinal space, it would be a moratorium placed on school closings. Another thing that would happen, I would really look at a living wage ordinance. And what do I mean by that? So when the big box stores come through, whether it be Target, Walmart, or whoever, but when they come through to actually have this living wage so that people can actually get their needs met on a basic level and be able to thrive and not just survive, because a lot of times the decisions that are made in survival mode often operate to the detriment of other people, right? Because if you're trying to eat, you may do some things that are not too sanguine to the health of yourself and others. And a lot of times we don't put that forward. So I think those two things I will push for heavily in terms of curbing violence. Another thing is this revisiting these strategies around these police strategies or law enforcement strategies around containment in particular communities, right? So this thing around the fact that if you see more cops, that this is now going to deter any type of violent acts or what have you. So what this current moment means to me is that young folks are crying out for things to do that are productive in their lives, and if they don't, they could easily fall into those particular traps. So this thing around being clear about in and no school closings, and putting forward a living wage, I think are critical elements. I thought quite a bit about this when you gave me the question early on, but this thing around really looking at that, because this is when this violence, when we talk about violence, we're not talking about it's real. The factors that really influence violence in a place like Chicago, in a hyper-segregated city, in a city where poor folks are in many spaces marginalized, isolated, and contained. So this type of thing around really understanding this, and this violence or responses to violence by city powers being this kind of engineered conflict to push marginalized groups even further away from the city. So I mean, and not conspiratorial as a terms of public policy. So I think those two things become critically important.
Well, if the real diabolical plan is to push low-income African Americans out of the city, that's going to happen anyway, because most of our families came to Chicago 1 or 2 generations. Like I said, I'm a second generation in Chicago, if you will. Well, no, first. If I think about it, I'm first generation. So a lot of us gonna move anyway. I mean, that's just a natural progression of things. You know, we're not too far from Little Italy. I mean, how many the old Italians? Some folks are gone. It's a new Little Italy over here on Taylor Street.
Right.
So those demographic shifts are going to change.
But it's one thing. But I think.
But I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. No. What you said. You think I'm going to disagree with you?
Yeah, but I think that there's a thing around that, right? So if we look at moving patterns or migration patterns of folks in cities, and I like that you used the example of Little Italy. Remember, UIC was dropped on top of Little Italy, right? This was actually one of the closest things that you actually had to a mixed race community, having Italian folks, Latino folks, and black folks, because we're here on the near west side. So we had this space. So UIC actually gets dropped on those folks' communities. In fact, when I first got here, I remember I was having lunch across the street, and I was talking to an older white woman, and she said, "We're sitting right now where my living room used to be." So this type of understanding, and then so if we look at that, those types. So if we talk about Little Italy, we also have to look at those changes in cities, right? So as UIC was dropped on top, the folks who were able to remain now maybe have transitioned out and may not have passed on those houses to family members or children. And the same thing in black communities, in terms of the question is whether or not, it's one thing if a community actually transitions out because of, folks start to transition in senior citizenship and actually transition out. But it's another thing if we actually have these factors, these heavy push factors that now make the space unlivable. Right?
Well, like I said, and to span the conversation, we get back to crime. When I was a kid, what did they have? They had urban renewal, Negro removal. Right. I mean that was back in the day. We always had these struggles, and when that's why we have to talk to professors to really give us some analysis or some context to think about these things. But other than having a moratorium on the schools, what would you do?
Right. I think another thing.
Other than that,
yeah. I think, but again, going back to that living wage piece, because again, we talk about what people are doing, and we talk about people operating in survival mode, and you don't necessarily make the best choices if you're operating in survival mode.
No, you just don't.
And this is what many of young folks and families in our communities find themselves in these situations. So if we understand that, what would be impetus to really push a space where folks can thrive, right? And not just from opening a community center, but asking a question around what are you actually doing in that place, right? Another thing, if I was alderman or mayor, this thing around real support for early childhood education, right? And again, so a lot of times these quote unquote strategies are more longitudinal, because it's not this thing of, okay, we do one thing and crime is going to instantly decrease. It just won't work, right? But this thing around actually a longitudinal, protracted commitment in terms of full-on preschool education, early childhood education, especially paying specific attention to pre-K through 6th grade, because we know that if young folks do well in those spaces, there's a greater chance for them to do well as they get older. This thing around school closings, and again, a living wage, because these are what we will call holistic supports for families. Another thing that comes in. So now in school space, this thing of what the CTU has been asking for, right? More school nurses, more counselors, more social workers, and nutritious lunches, right? That to me, that's not a budget issue as much as that is around political will, right? If you can pay some random podunk 6 figures to work in central office, you've probably talked about the salary of at least 2 to 3 counselors. And the lunch piece, that's just a contractual issue, right? You can actually make sure that the contract is supplying nutritious lunches. I mean, you can even change it. We found this out at the school that I'm working with. You can change what's served in vending machines, right? But this is all around political will, right? So this thing around asking those questions, I think, really, and this is just me coming from my own knowledge base as an educator, but seeing that those things protractedly really address these larger issues. And you see those results over time in opposed to immediate space, because a lot of times it's kind of immediate thing really contributes to the prison industrial complex.